Welcome back to another episode of The Road Chose Me. My name's Dan Grech, and on today's episode, let's continue the build of my Overland Jeep Gladiator. And I can't quite bring myself to drill big holes in this thing just yet, so today I'm going to tackle installing an ARB air compressor under the hood of my Gladiator. And I've talked before, I'll link the video here, about why I think the single air compressor is the best choice for overlanding and not the dual that everyone assumes. And that really does come down to weight rating. This thing is half the weight of the double, which means all that extra weight I save in payload. So I can bring more fuel and more water and more food and more enjoyment than someone who has the dual air compressor. This is also a lot smaller, which means I can actually tuck it here under the hood instead of putting it in the passenger compartment or in the bed where it takes up space where other things could actually be stored. Of course, it also uses less electricity, which is great. It means I'm not going to overload my electrical system. I don't need to think about an even bigger auxiliary battery. And of course, it airs up my tires perfectly fine. On the Wrangler I drove around Africa, it would take my 33-inch tires from 20 PSI up to about 35 PSI in about 60 seconds per tire. And to be honest with you, it was always just a great excuse to drink some cold water, maybe take some photos, have a look around. What difference does it make if it takes me 5 or 8 minutes to air up instead of 4 minutes to air up? I really think the benefits of the single compressor far outweigh the dual compressor. So enough preamble, let's get into mounting this air compressor and figuring out the wiring so that it's permanently wired into my Jeep. So I'll mount the air compressor under the hood, and you might notice looking under the hood of my Gladiator, things are a little different than in North America. Because this is right-hand drive, a lot of the components have been switched. So the battery is actually over on the left-hand side, what would be the driver's side for you, as is the TIPM and most of the electronics, because over on this side, we have to have the brake booster, the steering, all of that kind of thing. So what that means is over here, there's quite a big space where we can mount something like an air compressor. And I've had an ARB single air compressor under the hood of my Africa Jeep for almost 5 years now and 150,000 miles or something, never had a single problem. So there's no doubt the air compressor can handle the heat, handle the dust and the mud of being under the hood. So I'm not worried about that at all. But what I've got here in my hand, this is a bracket made by a company called TLR Off. This is actually an Aussie company. So this is made right here in Australia. And this bracket is purpose made to mount the ARB single compressor over here in this big space that's kind of left by the steering and the brake booster. And I'll show you what that looks like now. So you can see there's a large space beside the brake booster here, and this bracket has been specifically made to pick up 2 factory bolts that are up on the firewall, and then there's 2 studs down much lower that actually will support the weight and that it also bolts onto. And so I've got instructions over there. I need to mount the compressor exactly as they say with these 4 mounting bolts. And it's even got a spot here to mount the switch. And on the far side, a spot to mount the relay as well. Then I'll run the wiring across the top of the firewall to the battery and I should be good to go. So I have everything laid out on the bench here. And as you can see, it can be a little bit daunting. I remember this wiring harness from when I installed the single compressor in my Africa Jeep. It's pretty complicated because this compressor can run air lockers. Of course, my Jeep has electronic Rubicon lockers, so I can remove quite a lot of the complexity from this. I just have to figure out how. But I'm going to leave that for the second, and I'm following the instructions here from the TLR bracket. And it looks like the first thing I need to do is mount the compressor actually onto the bracket, and then the orientation is important of exactly where the different components go. And the great thing about this compressor is that you can rotate the little air tank and you can move things around depending on what your fitment situation is like. So I'm going to do that right now, get it mounted to the bracket in the way it's supposed to be, maybe mount it to the vehicle, and then I'll start thinking about tackling the wiring once I scratch my head for a little while. Okay, so I mounted the air compressor to the bracket following the instructions. The ARB is really customizable, so it's great. And before I go any further, I thought it would be a good idea to come over here and test fit it and just make sure that it does actually clear everything. And it is relatively tight. It has about 1 centimeter, what's that, about 1/2 inch of clearance to the brake lines here. And then on the other side, there's I don't even know what that is, maybe a vacuum hose, about the same clearance. And over here, it's not too far away from the brake booster. So it's a fairly tight little spot that it fits in, but this bracket is purpose designed to make it fit. So it's absolutely perfect. I'm really happy with how it's sitting. It doesn't look like it's gonna rub on anything. So I'll keep going with the assembly, see what the next step is. Going through the ARB instructions, the next thing I have to fit is the pressure switch, which this is a little switch so that when the compressor reaches the right pressure, it'll actually turn itself off. And I don't have air lockers, so I'm not wiring it in to work with the air lockers, but I will wire it in with the relay and the switch so that when I'm airing up my tires, obviously if the hose is connected to my tire, I want the compressor to be running. But as soon as you take the hose off your tire, the compressor will keep building pressure, but at some point you want it to turn itself off before it will overpressure. So that's what this little pressure switch does. It kind of means that the compressor will automatically turn on and off as I'm using it as needed. And then when I hit the main off switch, then it's totally off. So pressure switch is important. And then obviously I need the chuck as well that the air hose is actually going to connect to. And these both get connected to the outlet of the compressor here. And it says to use a lot of Teflon tape on all of these little threaded fittings. Obviously these need to be airtight at whatever pressure the compressor is running at. I air up to 38 PSI, so it needs to handle at least that. So I'll show you what that looks like now. After another quick test fit, it's time to install the switch and the relay where they actually mount onto the bracket. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm actually just delaying, I'm wasting time because I don't wanna have to figure out exactly how the wiring goes. I feel like last time it was quite the head scratcher. And so these little steps are just me wasting time. All right, I'm happy with how the compressor is mounted to the bracket. I've got the chuck, I've got the pressure switch, and everything fits in. There's clearance in the Jeep. Now I've even got the switch and the relay installed. So pretty much I can't delay any longer as much as I'm trying to. It's now time to try and understand the wiring for this thing. And I do remember this was quite a beast last time and it took some head scratching and some real thinking about. So give me 10 minutes here. I'm gonna do some head scratching. And then I'll come back to you and I'll tell you what I've discovered. I think I better read the ARB instructions and I better lay this all out on the table. I can see where the relay plugs in, that's pretty easy to figure out. I think I remember that the switch plugs are labeled and numbered, and so that makes it easy to figure out as well as it's easy to tell what connects to the battery. And then there's just some extra stuff that would be lockers if you had those. So let me do some head scratching. I'll get back to you. All right, so I've been staring at this for a lot longer than I care to admit, and I've been poring over the wiring diagram from ARB, which is actually excellent, and I don't really understand it. The challenge here, what's going on, is that this whole thing is designed to run with air lockers, in which case you have multiple switches for the front and rear lockers, and the master switch to turn the whole thing on and off. And so the way that they do that, this is the wiring harness that connects to the actual compressor. And this, I think, is pretty easy to understand. These two massive ones just go to the battery, they go through a fuse. On this thing, I have these two little wires that go to the pressure switch that's on the compressor. The big fat wires with the connector, that goes straight to the pump. Obviously controlled by the relay, and the connector for the relay is really easy to identify. But then I start to lose it, because what happens is they've got this big long wire that you're supposed to put a connector on the end of, these 4 little spade terminals. And this connector, if you were to assemble it, is so that you can go through your firewall and you put this connector inside your vehicle on the other side of the firewall. And this is where all the switches go. So you have the master switch, you have your front locker switch, your rear locker switch, you have a wire to illuminate the lights in the dark, and you have ignition on wire. And so obviously I don't really need all of this because I don't have lockers, I'm not doing any of that. So my goal is to wire it without that thing, which means I'm left with this thing. And I've been playing for quite a while trying to figure out what actually triggers what. I even dug out my multimeter. Fun fact, I took this all the way around Africa with me. And I actually don't fully understand it yet. I still can't quite get how you make this thing turn on. And so luckily Dad just got home. And so I think the best way to do it is I'm going to plug everything in that I understand, which is the relay, the pressure switch, the big plug to the pump, and then wire this or touch this straight on the positive and negative battery terminals. And then I'm pretty sure that one of these 4 wires, if I touch it on the positive of the battery, that's going to trigger the relay. And so what I've been doing is testing with my multimeter. This red wire here actually goes to one of the connectors on the pressure switch, and then the other side of the pressure switch goes to the trigger on the relay. So my understanding, and I think this makes sense, if you give 12 volts to this, that basically flows through and tells the relay to turn on, which is going to make the pump work. All good and well. But what happens is if it builds too much pressure, because you don't have a hose on it or something like that, the pressure switch can then break that circuit, which is these 2 wires here. So even though you have the master switch turned on, you're not in control. The pressure switch is, so the pressure switch turns it off again by breaking that circuit. Then if you connected an air hose or something, the pressure switch reconnects and the whole pump turns on again. I'm pretty sure that's how it works. Let's connect it to the battery and find out. So we think if we touch this to the positive, then everything should turn on.
Should work.
Because this is the one that gets positive down to the relay. So you've got you've got that on the battery and on the body. And I got to make sure these other wires don't touch anything. Ready? So it should turn on, and then the pressure
switch will turn it off.
Pressure switch should turn it off. Here we go. Ooh. Ooh.
Might be up to pressure.
Might be up to pressure. Maybe your negative's not good enough. Let's try. I'll put that on the battery.
I'd be surprised, but
keep coming. Okay, ready? There we go. All right.
That worked as planned.
That worked as planned. Let's. Okay, that's not connected to anything. We're not going to cause trouble.
No electricity over there.
We hope. All right, let's connect the hose to the tyre, because then the pressure switch shouldn't cut it out.
Okay.
And then it should run for a while.
Until we decide to stop.
Yeah, for as long as we want to.
Until the tyre blows up.
Well, yeah, preferably we'll stop before then. All right, let's try that again. I have to keep these 3 separate. I'll do the negative again. It's not going to start yet. Where am I back there? All right, ready?
Yep.
So we'll go like 5 seconds. Should come on. Yeah. And it's pumping up the tyre. Yeah, it's perfect.
Sounds right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, yeah, and it would have kept going because the pressure switch isn't in play. That's it. Yeah.
It works.
So it's this wire here. I have to get 12 volts to this wire.
Right.
And
through the switch.
Through the switch. I'll pull this loom apart and make that work. Yeah, all right, thanks, perfect. So now that I understand it, my goal is to strip out all the extra wires I don't need from this harness, namely the ones that control the solenoid and all the extra ones that go up to that connector that would in theory be inside my vehicle, but which I'm not going to have because I don't have locker switches. So I'm going to pull this whole harness apart, strip out all of those extra wires, tape it all back up, cut it all to length, and I should be pretty close to finished. All right, so it's all done and ready to go in. I've got the compressor mounted on the bracket. I finally figured out all the wiring. That took a lot longer than it should have. And I've got it all tidy here on the back of the bracket, taped up and then zip tied into little holes that are provided on the bracket, so the wiring isn't gonna bounce around and rub its way through on anything. I also added a little bit of spaghetti protection to that section of cable. That's before the fuse. Then I'm gonna run out the wires to the battery, cut them to length, and before I put crimps on the far end for the battery terminals, I'll put some spaghetti strapping on that now. So, last thing to do is actually put it in. So there we have it. I did up the 4 bolts that hold the bracket to the Jeep. I ran the main wires across, and then I just put crimp terminals on to the battery. So now it's wired in. And the way I like to have it, this is how it is in my Africa Jeep. Right now the whole thing is turned off because the switch is off. But when I flip the switch that's right here, basically the compressor comes on until the pressure switch tells it to cut off. And so at this point, the compressor's on and ready to go. If I connect my hose to it, as soon as I plug it into one of the tires, the pressure switch obviously will see the pressure drop and it will turn the compressor on again, and I can walk around and air up all 4 of my tires. And then when I'm finished, I always do turn the switch off again so that it's not sitting there, just will always run, occasionally as the pressure drops. So that's how I like to have my air compressor mounted under the hood. It's out of the way, it's light. Like I said, my existing one's been there for 5 years and I've never had a problem with it. So I'm confident that I'm not gonna have a problem with this one as well. So I hope that's been enjoyable. I hope you've learned a thing or two. If you have, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel. This is literally the 2nd modification to this Jeep, and there are a lot of things to come. Dad actually just said to me, he's ready to cut a hole in this thing. So why don't we do that next? We're gonna cut a big hole in the hood right about here. So stick around, plenty more to come in this build series. Thanks for watching, and maybe I'll bump into you on the road.